I'm Jeremy Parrish, and this is Game Boy World. Every system worth its salt has one defining game that establishes the direction of the platform and sets the tone for its future. For Game Boy, that defining game showed up about 6 weeks after the system launched in Japan. In fact, it arrived soon enough that Nintendo was able to offer it as a day one pack-in outside of Japan. Tetris wasn't originally designed for Game Boy. In fact, it had already appeared on several platforms by the time it rolled out on Game Boy. Yet the Game Boy version has become, to the mind of many, the definitive version of Tetris against which all other iterations must compare, and which inevitably falls short. Designed in 1984 in the depths of Soviet Russia on a 70s-style mainframe by a man named Alexei Pajitnov, Tetris was 5 years old by the time Game Boy launched. It had already become embroiled in quite a few copyright and licensing disputes. The game had already appeared in the West, mostly without a licensing agreement, on several platforms by 1989. It showed up on computers, showed up in the arcades, and even the infamous Tengen version for NES launched in the US mere weeks before the Game Boy Tetris debuted in Japan. Still, despite all the contention, Tetris remained something of an underground phenomenon in the West until Nintendo decided to make a personal crusade of it. The company pushed the NES version the hardest, probably for political reasons. Through the various dealings of a man named Hank Rogers, who ran NES Tetris developer Bulletproof Software, Nintendo's rendition of Tetris for NES was the legitimate console version, and it squeezed Tengen's earlier release out of the market. Still, for all the debate and pomp and circumstance surrounding the NES versions of the game, it was the Game Boy rendition that really had the most profound impact, and for good reason. It was a perfect fit for its system, and it came as a pack-in. Despite its small screen and lack of color graphics, Game Boy offered a stunning rendition of Tetris. And why not? The original mainframe version appeared on a device that lacked the ability to render graphics at all. Pajitnov's Tetris consisted entirely of text characters. By comparison, that made the Game Boy version comparatively opulent. And really, all you need to make a rudimentary, playable version of Tetris is a 10 by 20 pixel display, left and right buttons, a drop button, and a spin button. Tetris was so simple, it could have worked on the Microvision, let alone Game Boy. Of course, it helped that Game Boy Tetris actually was a top-tier interpretation of the game, better than Bulletproof's own NES version. For some reason, Nintendo's official console port of Tetris lacked competitive play, which, again, was a feature present in Tengen's Tetris, which has led many to declare that the superior problem, and probably accounts for the fact that Nintendo was so eager to push their own version of the NES game. But the Game Boy release put the link cable to use for glorious head-to-head play. This version may have lacked color, but it didn't need it. The weirdness of two companion releases from the same developer and publisher lacking the same feature set aside, Game Boy Tetris was a perfect demonstration of Game Boy's appeal. Tetris consists of puzzle pieces, aka tetraminos, arranged in 7 different configurations of 4 squares, dropping from the top of the screen and piling up at the bottom. When those blocks form an uninterrupted horizontal line, that line vanishes and all blocks above that line shift downward. Tetris requires no full screen scrolling, no flashy animation, and no color. Your eye can read the tetramino shapes at a glance without color. The more lines you complete, the faster the blocks fall until you hit top speed. And in the basic mode, you just play until the blocks pile up to the top of the screen. It's the essence of simplicity, and it's deeply addictive. And that simple, addictive pick-up-and-play style proved a perfect fit for the Game Boy's capabilities and nature. Need to kill a few minutes somewhere? Jump in and play a round of Tetris. Long before phones were pocket-sized supercomputers capable of playing visually stunning minigames, we had Tetris. Super Mario Land may have been Nintendo's proud tech showcase for Game Boy, but Tetris defined the system. Indeed, it defined portable gaming. Simple bite-sized play? Check. In fact, besides the standard mode, Game Boy Tetris featured something called Mode B, a sort of puzzle challenge in which the screen came pre-filled with garbage blocks, and players had to complete a set number of lines to win. Not particularly Nintendo-ish? Check. Geometric shapes, an abstract border, some vague Russian, though not Soviet, iconography, that was about it. Though Nintendo had made its fortune on kid-friendly mascot characters, Tetris appealed to a far broader audience than Super Mario Land by being so very neutral. Decades later, Nintendo's touch generations for DS and their Wii Whatever series would adopt a similar tactic. Great competitive play? Check. Fun as it was to simply vie for a personal best score, Tetris really excelled through the use of the link cable. While the need for the cable was slightly limiting in a physical sense compared to, Wi-Fi, head-to-head Tetris was actually quite straightforward and required much less setup than contemporary competitive games. There was no matchmaking or anything along those lines, just plug and play. And of course, Tetris's great soundtrack, composed by R&D1's Hirokazu Hip Tanaka, didn't hurt either. With its brisk, Cossack-influenced electronic melodies, Tetris's tunes set the mood for the game's quick pace, and gave players a reason to make use of Game Boy's stereo headphone jack. Honestly, I can't think of a more perfect game to showcase Game Boy's strengths than the Tetris. Nintendo probably lost a bit of money by packing the game in with the hardware here in the US. The system and pack-in together cost about as much as a system alone in Japan. But considering Tetris helped sell tens of millions of systems and made Game Boy the most successful console ever until PlayStation 2 came along, I think Nintendo turned out okay in the end. For more on Game Boy's history, check out GameBoyWorld.com.